A boss rush seems like a placeholder idea. Redoing all the bosses you did before feels like the game is trying to stretch for time. But people love boss rushes. Well, people love some boss rushes. There's technique and nuance to designing a great boss rush, and jamming together a whole bunch of bosses mindlessly is not going to hit those same highs as a well-crafted one. Let's talk about getting the band back together and what goes into creating a top-tier boss rush. Skillshare's back, baby, and they're sponsoring this episode. Mike bought a synth a few months ago to start a new hobby for fun. He's been learning how to set up the hardware with help from Skillshare through Dom McLennan's class called Digital Music Production DAW Fundamentals. Dom takes you through a quick tour of the software and helps you get to know how to set up a digital music creation space from scratch. We got some custom sound effects in the Mario Kart items episode thanks to that synth, and thanks to Dom's class. You can develop a skill you never thought you'd have with Skillshare's thousands of classes on basically every creative topic: illustration, creative writing, music, animation, and now you can build your career skills too, with classes on productivity, marketing, and entrepreneurship. Skillshare's classes are high quality and condensed, and can get you to where you want to be as fast as possible. Skillshare lets you try out their whole catalog for free for 1 month, any topics you want. You'll be amazed at what you'll learn over at Skillshare if you use the link in the description. The first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1 month free trial of Skillshare. Go learn a new hobby this summer. Thanks, Skillshare. Let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. What is a boss rush? A boss rush is a sequence where you fight a bunch of bosses in a row. More than 2 of them, most likely. There we go. That wasn't so bad. Oh, it's that too, isn't it? So, a boss rush is also a style of game where the game is about fighting bosses. Maybe exclusively, maybe like 95% of it, but you're there for the boss fights. Boss rushes are 2 distinct things, and it's about 50-50 as to which side someone is talking about when they bring it up. Okay, don't panic, we can still do this in one video. Turns out that a lot of tips for one type overlap with the other. Alright, so what's the ultimate basic, simple, basic Bob's basic boss rush? If we've got a game with bosses in it, let's just take all of them in the game and make you fight them back to back. Done. Basic. That is a boss rush. Is it a good boss rush though? Well, maybe. Let's see. A parade of bosses in the same arena is about as simple a setup as you can get. That's what Wo Long does. Wo Long is a Souls-like loosely set in Three Kingdoms era China, made by, you're not gonna believe this, Koei Tecmo and Team Ninja. And they've added a boss rush mode in a recent patch. Beat Dong Zhuo, wait a couple of seconds, and now there's Sun Jian. Beat him, now there's Yu Ji. Back to back, one after another, until you're done. It's fine, it's a pretty good boss rush, and it's optional. Wo Long is a modern example, but Mega Man is the classic example of almost the same thing, and seemed to make Capcom fall deeply in love with the boss rush. Whether it's the Classic series, the X series, the Zero series, or Battle Network, you can't have a Mega Man without one. Typically, the Mega Man platformers play it straight, with all the 8 main bosses waiting for you either in portals or in between mini-stages. Mega Man bosses are designed around being weak against specific weapons, but you're not guaranteed to have unlocked that weapon on your first encounter with a given boss. This time though, you're fully kitted out, so it's just a matter of using your resources correctly to burn right through each of the Robot Masters or Mavericks, or another existential anime robot you're fighting. It's not quite the same encounter the second time around thanks to the upgrades, or at least it won't be for every single boss. The sequence reinforces the progress you've made in character power and skill, and keeps the pace from dragging. Though that doesn't mean that jamming bosses back to back works in every game. One problem can just be the sheer length of it all. Okami is an incredible Zelda-style game with a super strong final boss and ending, and a horribly long boss rush right before it. Okami is sometimes called a trilogy in one game. Every piece of it is very substantial. Towards the end, right after a lengthy dungeon with its own climactic boss fight, the story seems to be gearing up for a grand finale. We're headed to the Arc of Yamato for one last section. Step into the Ark and see what awaits you. Odd. Instead of a final dungeon, you get a hub room with 5 doors, each with a painting of an old boss. Oh, I see where this is going. Okami's bosses are not quick things. They each follow a similar design approach, where they're big spectacle puzzle bosses where you have to methodically use a specific ability to expose a weakness, wail on what you've exposed, then repeat. There's a grandiosity to each one that's nice, and the style works great as an end cap to a big dungeon. However, length and grandiosity are not friends of the boss rush format, and repeating puzzles with the same solution is not the friend of really any format. The Ark of Yamato has you replay 5 of those bosses before you can reach the end. None of the bosses are different at all. At all. Each boss's length is partially carried by the novelty of figuring out how to damage these things in the first place. And without that, each fight isn't challenging or interesting enough anymore to hold your attention in a repeat playthrough, even in isolation. These bosses are much better on your first run of the game. By far the worst one of the set is Orochi, who I've griped about in other videos. You've already fought Orochi twice by this point, and the second one wasn't that long ago. Fighting Orochi for a third time, again with 0 changes, is one of the least rewarding boss fights I've ever seen. Blatant padding in a game that was already pushing it. Okami's boss rush does a disservice to its players, showcasing nothing new and sapping your interest in the lead up to what really is a fantastic final boss that happens right after. A few years later, Okami got a sequel on the DS called Okamiden, and it learned nothing. They did the exact same thing in its finale. Don't do that. The basic idea of a boss rush works in just about any genre, not just action, not just RPGs. Even something completely different like rhythm games can make a boss rush out of stacking big challenges one after another. In DDR, there are challenge modes and courses, playlists of songs thrown in front of players back to back without breaks. The most difficult courses are made up of the hardest songs in the game, a challenge in normal circumstances, and more so when you have to do them all in a row. There's even the extra factor in dance games where, since you're physically moving around, stacking the challenges back to back with no rest is literally harder to do as you get more and more tired. The challenge compounds on itself, and becomes a literal test of endurance. Even if you pick only a few bosses to use, a boss rush can still be kind of long. What if instead we shortened up the fights a little? It's more work than just leaving the fight as is, but you can edit down a boss rematch to be more of a sampling than the full thing. Like in Pizza Tower. Pizza Tower has you playing as Peppino, an exhausted and very anxious pizza chef whose sanity is hanging on by a thread. For no reason besides spite, a malevolent pizza head has decided to destroy your pizzeria, and you have to climb the pizza tower to stop him. Each of the 5 floors of the tower takes you through a handful of levels capped off by a pizza-themed weirdo for a boss, a pepper artist, a cowboy blob of cheese, a literal parody of the Noid called The Noise, and a creepypasta. Each boss is super cartoonish and kinetic in both mechanics and presentation, complete with multiple phases, bizarre but not too complicated attack patterns, and catchy music. These aren't easy fights, but you should get through them after a few tries. Very solid. The 5th and final boss fight against Pizza Face is a big ramp up in challenge. After you get through his first phase, he reveals that he's not an evil floating pizza, but instead an even more bizarre, washed up, old-timey cartoon pizza mascot named Pizza Head. Alright. Finally get through him, and it's all over, right? Right? Of course not. Pizza Head brings back all the old bosses you already fought for a good old boss rush. Get ready for 5 more bosses, Peppino. Peppino unleashes a rapid-fire beatdown of the first boss, taking half his health bar and setting up the rest of the sequence. Peppino runs this gauntlet in a powered-up fever state, and he can melt through each of the bosses much faster than before. That alone keeps the segment from being an utter slog like it could have been. Each fight takes a quarter of the time of the original, which turns it into more of a medley or a supercut, rapidly moving from boss to boss. The song sets the mood, and a few more minor tweaks make it not feel exactly the same to fight everyone. The whole sequence is catharsis for Peppino, and the game adds in more health pickups to help you get through it. At the end, you get your reward, a 3rd and final phase of Pizza Face. then a grand escape from the crumbling tower of pizza. Tower. The boss rush here is mandatory, but it's woven into the story in a way that gives it a real reason to exist and creates its own memorable moment to cap off a great game. One of the biggest stumbling blocks with a boss rush tends to be whether or not people see it as forcing them to redo content they've already done. It's a divisive topic, and different people can see things differently. Some people like to revisit the old fight in the new powered up context, where they're better either extrinsically by stat boosts, better moves, some new game mechanic, or intrinsically by becoming better at the game over time. A boss rush can be proof of just how far you've come. Other people just won't care though. No matter the power or skill difference, these are still the same old fights. To them, taking the time to do them again is annoying, and keeps them from seeing the new stuff just behind the velvet rope. Some series have given credence to both sides of the argument, depending on the game. The Devil May Cry series has had a few approaches to a boss rush sequence. These games are built to be replayable, with a deep combat system that reveals more and more layers as you master it. Refighting bosses doesn't mean you're fighting them in the same way as the last time. New upgrades, new moves, new weapons, and new tactics can change how it plays out completely, and the scoring system lets you squeeze out even more reasons to keep trying. Devil May Cry 3 adds even more to its boss rush. Near the end of the game, there's a neat little boss rush puzzle. You're thrown into an MC Escher realm, filled with 9 murals depicting bosses and color jewels. The murals are portals, taking you right to a previous boss fight. The center of the hub is a special monolith where the 9 color jewels link together. Defeating one of the bosses lights up its jewel, and if you link enough of them to form a ring, you can go through and end the mission. This boss rush gives you full control over how you want to tackle it. If you didn't like a fight, you might not have to do it. Since many combinations will form a ring, you can choose your own path to fight through. And if you do want to go all out, you even get a nice health upgrade if you take care of all the bosses before leaving. There's an optimal path, of course. One of the rings only takes 3 fights to complete, but you do have to piece together that the game wants you to make a ring first. Devil May Cry 5 has a mini boss rush too, but it's not as puzzling. This is the final mission in the main story where you play as V, who fights using 3 different familiars. Until now. At the start of the mission, they're taken away and you're extremely vulnerable now that you've lost most of your combat options. Hey look, it's 3 portals. I wonder what they're for. Each one takes you to a boss you fought before as a different character, and before each fight you get to pick a familiar to regain. The bosses are slightly redesigned and balanced around these new circumstances. Having this different gameplay style on top of only having access to part of your moveset changes the feel of each encounter completely. It's the inverse of the usual boss rush approach where the second encounter is where you're more powerful. It shows that it doesn't matter as much in which direction your character's power has changed between fights, it mostly just matters that it has changed. You might have noticed that I skipped over 4. There's a reason. The reason is, it's bad. The boss rush part is bad. The game's not bad. Devil May Cry 4's boss rush is extremely filler content. DMC4 is already infamous for stretching itself very thin thanks to a rushed development cycle. The campaign has you playing as Nero, traveling across a few regions. Each region culminates in a major boss fight, with some minor bosses here and there in the middle. After battling your way through, the game seems like it's entering the endgame, and pits you against a chain of finale-looking bosses. But after that, you shift away from Nero and into Dante, where you get to go through the whole game again backwards, fighting the same major bosses in reverse order. The only difference is that you're Dante now. The refights in DMC5 work fine enough thanks to how drastically different each one changes, but Dante doesn't play that far off from Nero in 4. Fine, slog through it and get to the end. Once we get to the real final section, the game switches you back to Nero. If you thought the Dante section doesn't really count as a boss rush, you're right. Now is the boss rush. Right before the final boss, you have to fight the same bosses again as Nero again. Terrible. Oh no, it gets worse. In between each of this third set of fights, you're treated to a dice rolling minigame. The dice rolling minigame is also reused content. It was earlier in the game. It sucked then too. Can you control the dice? No. Well, yes, sort of. Does this Mario Party minigame feel like it belongs in Devil May Cry? Turns out no. What happens if you roll wrong? You have to fight another mini gauntlet inside this already terrible boss gauntlet. It's great. This boss rush is blatant, unrepentant filler, pace breaking at the worst possible time, padding the campaign that has already been stretched beyond its limits to rope you into repeating content you like to have put behind you. This is textbook what not to do. Now if you really, and I mean really want a dice game in the middle of a boss rush, look at Cuphead. Cuphead itself could maybe be called a boss rush game, since 90% of it is the boss fights, and the platforming in between doesn't amount to much. But its final world is undoubtedly a boss rush by itself. The semi-final fight pits you against King Dice. Before you can fight him yourself, you have to dice it up to get there. Roll from a 1 to a 3 and move that many spaces along a board, where 9 spaces will trigger a unique mini-boss you have to fight. Damage transfers between rounds, and there are no checkpoints, so best be ready. Ironically, luck isn't too much of a factor here. There are free spaces placed between every 3 boss spaces, and the dice itself is timeable. You can consistently land where you choose to, so if you do it right, you only have to fight 3 mini-bosses before getting to King Dice himself. The spaces aren't randomized, so you can even pave a fight path of your own choosing if you have some favorites in mind. Some spaces do randomly have a health pickup, so you can choose to risk a specific fight to regain some health, but that's up to you. The major difference between this and DMC4 is that the bosses on this are all new. Turns out a boss rush can't feel like reused content if it's new content. Each boss isn't quite as complicated, but the endurance factor can make this whole sequence pretty tense. Cuphead underscores how the same format can feel so different if you just take the time to provide new content. Okay, we've gone over some of the what and how of a boss rush, but what about the why? Boss rushes can be tough to contrive a reason for them to happen, especially if you're trying to fold it into an existing narrative. You can sidestep it by putting it in an entirely separate mode in a menu outside of the game, but that's taking the easy way out. You can still make one make sense within the story you're telling. Maybe the boss rush can be a punishment for not taking care of business before. Breath of the Wild has no problem with you making a beeline toward the endgame from the very beginning. See that castle? You can go there. But your chance of success is pretty low if you're new to this thing. The game's structure involves you weakening the final boss by defeating some of Ganon's lackeys elsewhere in the world beforehand. Each Ganon Blight isn't that tough in isolation, but if you choose to head for the castle at the beginning anyway, you're going to have to face off against whichever of the Blights you hadn't defeated yet. It's a rush that, by definition, won't be repeated content, and you can dial back the challenge if you want by going out and playing the game as it was designed. But if you're looking for extra challenge on a repeat playthrough, this structure will give that to you in bunches. Okay, so coming up with a reason to fight is very useful, but what goes on between the fights is important too. What do players get to do in the liminal space? If the answer is nothing, well, we've already talked about what happens there, but lots of games give at least a little break between encounters. The liminal space of a boss rush can be a time to rest, recharge, and strategize. The Kirby games are full of fantastic boss rushes. It's become a fan favorite mode for over half of the series' history. Within the Kirbyverse, they're usually called the Arena or True Arena modes, though some games name the same thing a little differently. Traditionally, the basic arena modes are a straightforward boss endurance test. You'll fight most of, if not every boss and mini-boss the game has in a row in a mostly random order. The final bosses are saved for the end still. You get free reign to choose a copy ability at the start. Damage and status carries over between fights, but every time you beat something, you're taken to a resting hub. The hub has a handful of random abilities you can copy if you want to switch powers, or lose what you went in with before, and there's some healing items. But the healing items are all one-time use only. No healing restocks. It's a decent little challenge, but the bosses are all as they were in the main game. It's Kirby. These are the bosses meant to be beatable by little kids. This isn't a crazy hard challenge. If you beat the base arena mode and the game's extra campaign mode though, there's something else you might be interested in around back. Shh, don't tell nobody, especially the kids. Kirby's got a true arena mode, Kirby for big boys. This is the game's final challenge, the arena mode with a few extra hard twists. Between rounds, the health pickups are often weaker, and the extra copy ability options are scarce. The bosses are all the harder EX editions, where fights ramp up the challenge with new moves and upgraded old moves with much more intense attack patterns and aggressive AI. Get through those, and new exclusive super bosses await you at the end of the gauntlet. Often an old boss in a grotesque JRPG third phase form that extends the series lore. Some games even make you fight a couple of them just to really push you to the limit. It's the game throwing everything it can at you, underscoring the depth of what is designed to be a very accessible combat system. Kirby's True Arena Boss Rush has built a tradition that fans love and expect, serving as a superb final challenge to round out the game's difficulty and make the game feel a little more complete in an unexpected way. Lengthening the liminal space between fights is pretty much what creates the genre version of the boss rush. If breaks between bosses take up minutes of time, you can fit in all kinds of stuff. Shadow of the Colossus is a series of 16 bosses, and very little else. Between fights are some story beats and you traveling to your next destination to find and kill each of the world's colossi, so Wonder can definitely save the one he loves. There's barely any character stat progression, skill trees to advance, or points to assign. It's not even that complicated to find the next Colossus. It's just you in a strange land, alone with your thoughts and the scenery. Maybe some climbing. The game is a boss rush dragged out. Does it need anything else? Would the game be better if there were townspeople, side quests, or weapon stance unlocks or something? It'd be different, but I don't think it needs more. The boss rush format, minus the rush, is a style all its own. Did you know that that song for the Toad boss in Devil May Cry 4 uses the same sample as the song Dropout from DDR? That was a wild editing revelation. Let's talk in the comments about some more unusual boss rush formats. Maybe ones that have more risk and reward in their design. Boss rushes are a solid idea that depends more than most others on great execution. Avoid the temptation to treat it as filler, and customize it enough to make it worth doing, or just make it optional, and you can create that capstone challenge you dream of.